The basement sat 47 floors beneath the penthouse, deep in the belly of Manhattan, and it smelled like a century that had already died. Not the smell of mold or dust or old things left behind. It was the scent of iris, extracted by a method the fragrance world had buried in 1903. The scent of Kashmiri sandalwood, a raw material no supplier on American soil had been able to import for 30 years. And threaded through it all was something Maren Cole could not find a name for. She only knew one thing when that scent reached her. Her hands began to shake. The man standing at the foot of the basement stairs watched her tremble. He said nothing. No comfort. No explanation. He simply stood there in the dark and waited. 2 weeks ago, Maren did not know this man existed. 2 weeks ago, she was still bent over a workbench in someone else's lab, under someone else's name, with a formula she had uncovered herself, but was never allowed to claim. Now she stood here inside the secret fragrance vault of the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, her 10 fingertips stained with century-old essential oils, about to do something no one else in the world could do. But first, she needed to know where it all began. And it began with exactly 6 words. The girl just helps mix ingredients. If this story touched your heart, please like it so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to know that talent doesn't need permission to shine. And subscribe to our channel, because the next stories are even better. 2 weeks earlier, Maren Cole hadn't even known that scent existed. She stood inside the laboratory of Sable Fragrances, on the 3rd floor of an old building in the Flatiron district of Manhattan. For 8 weeks, she had been working with the notebook. 8 weeks bent over the blending table from 6 o'clock in the morning until the hallway lights went dark. 8 weeks decoding every handwritten line blurred by water. 8 weeks of testing and failing and trying again until the scent in the sample bottle matched what some nameless woman had written down more than 100 years before. The brown-covered notebook, its spine stitched with red thread, had been something she bought in a box of old things at a Brooklyn antique market for $12. She bought it because she needed the small glass vials in the box to store ingredients. The notebook had been buried at the bottom, among cleaning rags and old newspapers. She had almost thrown it away. Then she opened it. Then she couldn't sleep for 3 nights straight. Now, 8 weeks later, she was adding the final drop into the test sample bottle. Her left hand held the dropper. Her right hand rested flat on the table, palm turned upward, waiting. She let 1 drop fall onto her wrist. She didn't use a mouillette strip the way most perfumers in the industry did, because paper only told her how a scent behaved in the air, while skin told her how a scent lived on a human body. Skin reacted to heat, to sweat, to the pulse moving underneath. Skin didn't lie. She lifted her wrist to her nose and closed her eyes. The top note rose first, light and sharp. Then the heart note arrived, warmer, rounder, the kind of warmth that belonged to wood polished by hand, not by machine. Then came the bass note. She held her wrist beneath her nose for another 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. The bass note didn't collapse. It didn't turn harsh. It didn't shift into a metallic smell the way it had in the previous 43 attempts. It held. Deep. Full. Exact. She opened her eyes. "All right," she said. Not to anyone. There was no one else in the lab except Juno Park, sitting at the administrative desk near the door, recording ingredient purchases. Juno looked up. She didn't ask what was all right. She looked at Maren's face and understood. After 3 years of sharing the same room, Juno had learned that when Maren said, "all right," in that voice, with that rhythm of breath, it meant she had just finished something she hadn't been sure she could finish. Juno added 1 more line to the ledger, capped her pen, and said, "This time's different from the others." "This time's right," Maren said. "You've said that for the 44th time now. This time, it really is right." Juno looked at her for another moment. Then she gave a small nod. Between the two of them, nothing more was needed. For 3 years, Juno had sat at that desk, recording every ingredient Maren bought, every gram of essential oil Maren imported separately with her own wages, completely apart from the workshop's inventory. For 3 years, Juno hadn't asked why Maren bought separately, recorded separately, kept things separately. She didn't need to ask. She knew. At Sable Fragrances, everything Maren created carried a name, and that name wasn't Maren Cole. That name was Aldrich Sable, the owner of the workshop, 52 years old, the man standing on every perfume bottle, every contract, every interview in the trade magazines. Maren blended. Aldrich signed. That was how the workshop operated. That was how it had always operated. Juno. I've been taking care of myself since I was 18. Juno looked up. Marin didn't look at her. She was looking at the sample bottle on the table, her voice calm, as if she were reading an ingredient label. 9 years. For 9 years, I haven't asked anyone for anything. Not for a job, not for a place to stay, not for a chance. I found things myself, learned things myself, did things myself. She paused. This bottle is the best thing I've ever made. And tomorrow, Aldrich will put it on the table in front of the client and call it a product of the workshop. Juno said nothing. She set her pen down. The sound of the pen touching the desk was very soft in the quiet lab. Marin looked at her. He just called down. The new owner of the building is coming this afternoon to look at the workshop. Aldrich wants the sample displayed. What's his name? Gallagher. I don't know his full name, only that he bought this building last week. Marin nodded. She placed the sample bottle on the rack, exactly where Aldrich would see it first, when he led the guest inside. Then she turned back to the blending table, wiped her hands with a cloth towel, and waited. She didn't know that in a few hours, the man named Gallagher would walk into this laboratory, smell the sample bottle on the table, and recognize what Aldrich Sable would never recognize. She didn't know that he would look at her hands and see what no one in that room had bothered to see for 3 years. She only knew that the sample bottle on the rack was the best thing she had ever made, and in a few hours, it would carry the name of a man who couldn't tell a heart note from a bass note. Knox Gallagher walked into Sable Fragrances at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the first thing he did wasn't look at people. He looked at the room. His eyes moved from the ceiling to the floor, from the windows to the walls, from the shelves of raw materials to the blending table, slow and methodical, the way someone did when he was used to evaluating a space, before evaluating anyone standing inside it. Most real estate buyers would look at walls, look at floors, calculate square footage. Knox looked at the way light fell into the room. He noticed the sample bottle on Marin's workbench, and his nose shifted almost imperceptibly before his steps came to a halt. Aldrich Sable met him at the stairwell in a tailored suit, his voice already arranged, smooth and assured in the way of a man who never doubted his ownership over anything in this building. Aldrich led Knox through the display area, through the packaging room, through the client reception space, talking as he walked about the brand, the vision, 20 years of building a reputation in the boutique fragrance industry. Knox didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions either. He followed Aldrich with even steps and measured distance. Not too close, not too far. The distance of a man who didn't need to impress but didn't allow anyone to forget he was there. When they reached the lab, Knox stopped at the threshold. Aldrich was still speaking. Knox wasn't listening anymore. He was smelling. The sample bottle on Marin's table was still uncapped. The top note had been drifting lightly into the air of the lab for hours, and now it reached Knox Gallagher's nose in the middle of Aldrich's unfinished sentence, about third-quarter margins. He stilled. Not the stillness of someone surprised, but the stillness of someone who had just heard a language he thought was extinct. He stepped toward Marin's table, picked up the sample bottle, brought it to his nose, drew in a slow, deep breath, eyes closing for half a second, then opened them. Aldrich stopped mid-sentence. He saw Knox holding the sample, and 20 years of instinct immediately began calculating. The client was interested in the product. Good, very good. Our latest fragrance, Aldrich said, his voice sliding into a familiar rhythm, smooth and confident. We've been developing it for 2 months. A proprietary formula based on classical extraction methods. Knox didn't look at Aldrich. He was looking at the bottle. Who made this? He asked. His voice was low and even, neither rising nor falling. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to be heard. Aldrich glanced toward Marin. She stood 3 steps away from the blending table, her hands still carrying traces of essential oil from the morning. She was cleaning tools. She didn't look up. She was listening. She only assists with mixing raw materials, Aldrich said. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't soften it. He didn't glance at Marin to see if she heard. He spoke in a completely ordinary tone, the tone of someone stating something so obvious it didn't require thought, like saying the sky was cloudy or the staircase had 17 steps. The formula belongs to the house. We have our own development team. Marin didn't stop her hands. She continued wiping the dropper with a cloth, steady, precise movements, the precision of someone pouring all her discipline into her hands, so the rest of her body wouldn't react. 7 words. She only assists with mixing raw materials. She had heard versions of that sentence many times over the past 3 years. From Aldrich, from clients, from partners. Never with cruelty. Always in a normal voice. That was the worst part. Knox set the bottle down. Then he looked at Marin, not at her face first. He looked at her hands, at the stains of essential oil that had seeped deep into the lines of her palms, into the edges of her nails, into the strip of skin between her thumb and index finger where she held the dropper every day for 3 years. The kind of stain soap couldn't remove. The kind that only existed on the hands of someone who worked directly with raw materials, day after day, year after year. Someone who only assists doesn't have hands like that, Knox said. He didn't look at Aldrich when he said it. Aldrich opened his mouth. Knox had already turned to Marin. "What is this built on?" he asked. Not a polite question. The question of someone who knew the answer would matter. Marin set the dropper down. She looked at Knox, and for a fraction of a second she weighed silence against speaking. Then she spoke. Iris extracted using cold enfleurage. The heart note is cashmere sandalwood, combined with labdanum resin, in a ratio of 3:1. The base uses a double curing method. First 14 days in ethanol solvent, then 7 days in jojoba oil to preserve longevity. Total time from raw material to finished scent is 8 weeks. 44 trials. The 44th was the first one that was right. The lab was very quiet. Aldrich stood between Knox and Marin, his hand lifting to adjust his cuff, a small, unconscious motion, the motion of someone rearranging control. "Mr. Gallagher, I can explain the technical details if you're interested," Aldrich said. Knox kept his eyes on Marin. "You used cold enfleurage," he said. "Not a question. A confirmation. No one's used that method since the early 20th century." "I know," Marin said. "That's why I had to reconstruct the process from old documentation." "What documentation?" Aldrich stepped forward. "Mr. Gallagher, all technical materials are the property of the house. I can provide a full summary if you require it." Knox didn't turn back to Aldrich. He held Marin's gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he picked up the sample bottle a second time, brought it to his nose again, and this time he didn't close his eyes. He inhaled with his eyes open, looking directly at Marin, as if testing whether the scent and the person in front of him matched. Then he set the bottle down. "I'll be back in 3 days," he said. He spoke to Aldrich but looked at Marin. Then he walked out of the lab, and the room warmed by 2 degrees after he left. The kind of warmth that came when something very still had just been lifted out of the space. Knox hadn't left the building yet. He stopped in the 3rd-floor hallway, right at the turn before the stairs, and spoke to Aldrich in the voice people use to sign contracts, not to make conversation. "I want a completed batch. 50 bottles. Same formula, same method, same hands that blended the sample just now. Her hands only." Aldrich didn't blink. 20 years in the industry had taught him how to keep his face still when he heard a large number or a difficult demand. He was very good at both. "Mr. Gallagher, my house has its own production process. We don't fulfill orders based on one individual. I have a master perfumer with more than 15 years of experience, fully capable of ensuring consistent quality across the entire batch." "I didn't ask about the process," Knox said. "I asked about the person who blended the sample. She's an employee of the house. She works under my direction." "Then direct her to blend 50 bottles. Aldrich drew a quiet breath through his nose. Not a sigh, just his way of buying himself half a second to choose his words. "Mr. Gallagher, I have to be honest. Miss Marin Cole is support staff. She has a certain gift with materials. I won't deny that. But handing an entire order of this scale to an assistant wouldn't meet the standards of Sable Fragrances." Knox looked at Aldrich. There was nothing remarkable on the surface of that look. Not cold, not heated, only steady and unbroken. The look of a man who had heard enough and was giving the other person one more chance to say something of greater value. Aldrich didn't recognize that chance. "However," Aldrich continued, his voice already slipping into the rhythm of negotiation, "if you want to guarantee Miss Cole's involvement in the process, I can arrange for her to supervise the materials under my master perfumer." "How much for her to leave your house?" Knox asked. The question came so fast and clean that it took Aldrich almost 2 seconds to process its meaning. "I'm sorry? I'm asking for the price. How much to buy Miss Cole out of her contract with you. I'll pay the termination fee, add a training fee if that's what you want to call it, and she'll blend this order under her own name. Name a number." Aldrich stood very straight. His spine stiffened in a way an outsider might read as confidence. But Marin, standing inside the lab door 4 steps away, read as defense. She heard all of it. The 3rd-floor hallway wasn't soundproof. It had never been soundproof. For 3 years, she had heard Aldrich speak with clients, with partners, with distributors through that thin wall. She had heard him take credit for her formulas. She had heard him call her support team, technical staff, lab assistant. Today, she heard him being asked for her price. She stepped into the hallway. No knock, no permission. She walked out and stood there, her hands still smelling of essential oil, and she spoke in a voice as flat as the table she had just wiped clean. "I'm not merchandise to be bought, Mr. Gallagher." Knox turned to look at her. He didn't seem surprised. There was something else on his face, something closer to recognition. The look of a man hearing confirmation of something he had guessed but hadn't yet known for certain. "No," he said, "you're not. A beat. But your work is worth more than anything this man pays you, and you know that." "I know," Marin said, "but knowing my worth and letting someone else put a price on me are 2 different things." The hallway went very quiet. Aldrich stood between them, and for the first time that afternoon, he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was calculating. Knox looked at Marin for another moment. Then he gave a slight nod, once. A nod that promised nothing but didn't close any doors either. He turned toward Marin's table, lifted the sample bottle from the rack with one hand, precise and unhurried, as if lifting a document he needed to read carefully somewhere else. 3 days, he said. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Marin. Then he went down the stairs. His steps were even, neither fast nor slow, the steps of a man who knew every door would open when he reached it, so there was no need to hurry. The sound of his footsteps faded on the lower floor. The front door closed, then silence. Aldrich turned to Marin. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke more softly than usual, softer than the voice he used with clients, so softly that Marin had to listen very carefully to catch each word, and that was exactly the point. "You will never speak directly to one of my clients again." Marin didn't answer, not because she was afraid, because there was nothing to answer. That sentence wasn't a question. It wasn't a warning. It was the declaration of an owner, reminding his property of its place. Aldrich adjusted his cuff. Then he walked away. His steps were steady on the hallway floor. Not fast, not slow, not angry. And Marin knew, from 3 years of standing inside that man's house, that when Aldrich Sable walked away with steps that even, something would change the next day, and it wouldn't change in her favor. The next morning, Marin arrived at the workshop at 6 o'clock, just like every other day. The lab door wouldn't open. The access code she had used for 3 years, the 4 digits she entered every morning without even looking at the keypad, no longer worked. She typed it again. Wrong. A 3rd time. Wrong. The small screen on the electronic lock flashed red 3 times, then went dark. She stood in front of the lab door with her bag on her shoulder and understood that Aldrich had begun. He had begun sooner than she'd expected. Usually, Aldrich let things settle for a few days, let the other person think they were safe, then acted. But this time, he didn't wait. Knox Gallagher had looked at Marin's hands and said the sentence no one in this workshop had ever said, and Aldrich understood that every day Marin remained in the lab was another day she might speak to someone she shouldn't speak to. So he cut her off. Fast, clean, without explanation. Marin knew Terrence had gone into the lab before her because she could smell it. She stood in the 3rd-floor hallway, 4 steps from the lab door, and the scent slipping through the crack told her everything. Iron sulfate. Sharp, harsh, the kind of harshness that belonged to metal overheated. Terrence was using the wrong heart note. He was using Mysore sandalwood instead of cashmere, or he was using cashmere in the wrong ratio, or he hadn't cured it long enough. Marin didn't need to open the door to know. Her nose told her what her eyes couldn't see. The scent was shallow. It lacked depth in the middle, the kind of absence an ordinary person wouldn't notice. But anyone with a real nose, anyone who had spent 8 weeks curing and testing and curing again until the heart note rounded out exactly right, would smell in half a second. Marin turned away. She passed the lab every morning for the next 3 days. She didn't knock. She didn't ask anyone. She only passed by, smelled, and knew. On the first day, The scent was still harsh. On the second day, it was harsher, because Terrence was increasing the dose to compensate for the shallowness, the method of a person trying to fix something wrong by adding more instead of changing the process. On the third day, the scent was lighter but still wrong. Wrong in a place Marin could have identified down to the gram if anyone had asked. But no one asked. Meanwhile, Aldrich prepared for what he called a strategic product launch. He booked a stage at an event space in Tribeca. He invited industry press, influential fragrance reviewers, and several distribution representatives. The invitation placed the name Sable Fragrances at the top, and beneath it was a line introducing Terrence Holt as Master Perfumer, the man behind the house's newest formula. Marin Cole's name didn't appear anywhere. Not on the invitation, not in the press release, not on the staff list. For 3 years, she had stood in that lab, and on paper, she had never existed. Aldrich did all of this without thinking about Knox Gallagher more than necessary. In Aldrich's mind, Knox was a real estate investor who had just bought the building, asked a few questions about perfume to seem interested in the asset he owned, then would forget about it within a week. Powerful men didn't care about the details of fragrance. They bought brands, not scents. Knox would receive the batch, smell it briefly, nod, and write a check. That was how Aldrich's world worked. That was how it had always worked. And that was the greatest mistake Aldrich Sable had ever made. On the evening of the third day, Juno called Marin. The phone rang at 9:45. Marin was sitting in her rented apartment, the desk lamp on, the brown-covered formula notebook open in front of her. She opened it every night and read it again, not because she needed to check the formula, but because the blurred handwriting of some nameless woman from more than 100 years ago made her feel less alone. She answered. Juno didn't say hello. He booked a stage in Tribeca, Juno said. Her voice was dry and flat as accounting paper. Industry press has been invited. The invitation names Terrence Holt as Master Perfumer. Your name doesn't appear anywhere. Marin didn't answer right away. She looked at the notebook on the table, looked at the slanted, faded, patient handwriting on the yellowed page. Then she said, I know. You know, Juno repeated, not surprised. Silence settled over the line. The kind of silence with weight. The kind Marin had learned to read after 3 years of sharing a room with Juno Park. Then Juno spoke, slower, clearer. Each word set down like a number placed into a ledger cell. I still have the ingredient purchase books. 3 years. Not a single line missing. Marin closed her eyes. She didn't say thank you. Between the two of them, that word wasn't needed. She only said, keep them safe. I always do, Juno said. Then she hung up. The launch took place on Thursday night. Marin knew because Juno sent her the livestream link at 6:45, without any message. Just the link. Marin sat on the bed in her rented apartment, her back against the wall, her phone resting on her knees. She tapped the link. The small screen lit up. Aldrich Sable stood at the center of the stage. She wasn't surprised to see that he looked perfect. Aldrich always looked perfect when he stood in front of other people. He spoke about the creative journey, about passion, about returning to classical extraction methods that the modern fragrance industry had abandoned. He pronounced the word enfleurage in flawless French, the kind of pronunciation of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror until it sounded as though he had grown up in grass instead of queens. Marin recognized every sentence, not because Aldrich repeated her words, but because he repeated her ideas. The ideas she had written in the technical reports she submitted to him every week, the ideas she had explained to him in the lab when he asked why the curing took so long and why they couldn't use a cheaper alternative. He took her knowledge, wore it, and presented it as though it had grown from his own mind. Terrence Holt stood beside Aldrich, his hands clasped in front of him. Beneath his name on the screen, the words, Master Perfumer. Terrence didn't speak much. He nodded at the right moments, smiled at the right moments, and when Aldrich introduced him as the man behind the fragrance, Terrence accepted it with the expression of someone who believed he deserved it, or at least believed that standing there was right because his employer had told him to stand there. Marin didn't know what Terrence thought. She didn't care. She cared about one thing only, and it happened in the 23rd minute of the live stream. A fragrance industry reviewer, someone with more than 200,000 followers on social media, was invited onto the stage to smell the sample directly. He took the bottle, sprayed it onto a mouillette strip, lifted it to his nose, waited, smelled again, waited a little longer. The camera zoomed in on his face. Marin saw the moment. The very small moment when the reviewer's eyebrows drew together just slightly. Not enough for a general audience to notice, but enough for anyone in the craft to understand that he was smelling something that wasn't right. Very interesting, the reviewer said, his voice professional, measured. The top note is impressive. There's depth, but the heart is a little harsh. I'm sensing a slight sharpness in the middle that could be softer. And the base, to be honest, lacks the depth that the opening promises. It doesn't hold. Aldrich smiled, the practiced smile, and said something about how fragrance needed time to open on the skin. The reviewer nodded politely. But he didn't smell it again. He set the mouillette strip down and stepped off the stage, and Marin knew that the review he would write that night would be polite, but not good. Polite, but accurate. Polite but clear enough for anyone with a nose to read between the lines. She turned the phone face down on her knees. Her hands gripped the edge of the small table beside the bed. Tight, 10 knuckles whitening, tendons rising beneath the skin. All the force concentrated into her fingertips until she felt the wood press into her palms. She held it there. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then she let go. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the phone. She didn't call anyone. She sat still on the bed and looked toward the window of her rented apartment. Watched the streetlight outside cast a long, dull yellow streak across the ceiling. And she thought very clearly, very slowly, very calmly, that for 3 years she had stood inside someone else's lab and created things that man would never be capable of creating. And now she was sitting on her bed watching that man stand on a stage taking credit through a 5-inch phone screen. And the sample wasn't even right. That was the part that made her grip the table. Not that they had taken her formula, but that they had taken it and still couldn't make it correctly. She sat in the dim apartment until the streetlight went out. Then she stood, washed her face with cold water, and went to bed. Or she lay on the bed with her eyes open, and called that going to sleep. The next morning she woke at 5 o'clock and read the brown-covered notebook again from the first page. Not because she needed to, because the faded handwritten lines of a nameless woman from more than 100 years ago had taken nothing from anyone, stood on no one's stage, and needed no recognition to know she was right. The phone rang at 8 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't Juno, an unknown number. Marin answered and heard the landlord's voice, a man she had met exactly once when she signed the lease 2 years earlier. Polite, but carrying the hurried rhythm of someone who wanted to end the call before it became uncomfortable. Miss Cole, I'm calling because there's an issue. I've received information that you're under investigation for violating a confidentiality agreement with your former workplace. I don't want to interfere in your personal matters, but this building has rules about tenants involved in legal disputes. I think it would be best for you to arrange new housing within 30 days. Marin stood in the middle of the apartment with the phone pressed to her ear. She didn't ask who had called the landlord. She didn't need to ask. Aldrich Sable had been in commercial real estate for 20 years before opening the fragrance house. He knew this building's landlord. He knew how to speak without threatening, while making the listener decide for himself that keeping Marin Cole as a tenant was a risk not worth taking. No need to own the building. Only one phone call. Only one sentence. Only place the words investigation and legal beside each other in the same sentence with someone who didn't want trouble, and let the mechanism operate on its own. I understand, Marin said. She hung up. Set the phone on the table. It vibrated again immediately. This time it was Juno. Marin. Juno's voice was flatter than usual, flat in the way of someone trying to keep every word in its proper place. Aldrich filed a complaint with the Fragrance Association this morning. He's accusing you of violating your confidentiality agreement. The complaint says you disclosed a proprietary production process to a third party without written approval from the house. A third party, Marin repeated. Knox Gallagher. He didn't name him. He only wrote a third party. But the meaning is very clear. Marin closed her eyes. Aldrich wasn't suing her for stealing the formula. He couldn't sue for theft, because he had just stood on a stage in Tribeca and called that formula a product of the house. If he sued for theft, he would have to admit Marin was the one who created it. So he sued for breach of confidentiality, accused her of disclosing the process to an outsider. Clean. No contradiction. No admission of anything about who had truly stood behind the formula. Simply turning Marin into someone who had broken the rules. If the complaint's accepted, Juno said, you'll be barred from practicing in the industry until the matter is resolved. Maybe 6 months, maybe longer. Marin opened her eyes. She looked at the rented apartment, looked at the brown-covered notebook on the table, looked at her own hands. the essential oil stains still faint in the lines of her palms, the kind of marks she had carried for 3 years and would carry for many more because her skin had absorbed them. Juno, I'm listening. Thank you. Don't thank me. Think. Juno hung up. Maren set the phone down. She stood in the middle of the rented apartment, in the middle of the morning, in the middle of a city of 10 million people. And she realized one thing with absolute clarity. For 3 years, she had stood in Aldrich Sable's lab. For 3 years, she had blended, tested, failed, tried again, finished, and submitted. For 3 years, not a single product had carried her name, not one contract had acknowledged her as the creator. Not one official piece of evidence, other than the ingredient purchase books Juno kept at the administrative desk, proved that Maren Cole had ever existed in that room, and now Aldrich was using the system itself to erase her from the industry. Her hands began to shake, not from cold. The shaking came from inside, from her chest, spreading down her arms, to her wrists, to the fingers still carrying traces of essential oil. She stood still, didn't grip the table, didn't lean against the wall. She stood in the middle of the room and let the tremor move through her body like a gust of wind passing through an open frame, entering and leaving without being held. She waited. 30 seconds. 1 minute. The shaking eased. Her breathing slowed. Then she bent down. On the table, beside the notebook, was the only sample bottle she had managed to keep, the one she had hidden in her coat pocket the day she was locked out of the lab, the last day she had still stood inside Aldrich Sable's laboratory as someone who belonged in that room. She took a cloth handkerchief from the drawer, wrapped the sample bottle, carefully, 2 layers of fabric, edges folded, placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, close to her chest. The sample bottle first, the notebook next. Personal belongings could come later. She didn't know where she would sleep after 30 days. She didn't know whether she would still be allowed to work after the association processed Aldrich's complaint. She didn't know many things, but she knew the sample bottle in her coat pocket was right. It was still right. And the notebook in the other pocket was hers, bought for $12 at a Brooklyn antique market, before she knew who Aldrich Sable was, before she ever stepped into Sable Fragrances, before she knew there were people who would take everything she created and call it by their own name. She put on her coat, checked both inner pockets. Sample bottle on the left, notebook on the right. Then she stepped out of the apartment, down the stairs, onto the sidewalk, and stood there, standing on a Manhattan sidewalk at 9 o'clock in the morning with everything she had in the 2 pockets of her coat. And she didn't know where to go. Maren walked from Manhattan to Brooklyn, not because she didn't have money for the train, but because she needed time for her feet to catch up with her head. And her head was moving much faster than her feet right now. She crossed the Brooklyn Bridge at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thin sunlight overhead, wind from the river brushing across her face, and she walked without looking at the river, without looking at the sky, only at the pavement ahead of her, 1 step at a time, the way a person walked when she was counting what she had left instead of what she had just lost. The 24-hour coffee shop on the corner of Atlantic and Court sat between a laundromat and a thrift store. Maren knew this place. She knew the table in the farthest corner, beside the back door, where the fluorescent light never reached all the way, so it was always a little darker than the rest of the room. She knew because she had sat at that table before. She sat down, ordered a black coffee, took 1 sip, set the cup down. Then she called Juno. Juno arrived in 40 minutes. She was still wearing the gray coat she wore to work every day, her shoulder bag on her left side, and she stepped into the coffee shop with the stride of someone who knew exactly what she had come here to do. She didn't ask, "Are you all right?" She didn't ask, "What happened?" She walked straight to the counter, bought a second coffee, set it in front of Maren beside the old one that had gone cold, and sat down in the chair across from her. The 2 of them sat in silence for a while. The shop was empty at that hour, except for 1 man sitting at the counter reading a newspaper, and the steady sound of the coffee machine running in the back. Maren looked at the new coffee. Then she said, without looking at Juno, her voice as flat as the Formica tabletop in front of her, "The last time I sat here, I had just turned 18. I had $17 in my pocket, and no one waiting for me anywhere." Juno didn't react. She sat still, both hands around her coffee, and waited. "And now?" Juno asked after a while. $43. Still no one waiting. Maren smiled. A soundless kind of smile, only a slight movement at the corner of her mouth, neither happy nor bitter, the smile of someone who had once sat at this exact table with empty pockets and survived, and knew she would survive again, just not yet how. Juno took a sip of coffee, set the cup down. "You can stay with me." "No." "Marin?" "No," Marin said again, this time looking straight at Juno. "Aldrich will know. He knows you're the only person at the workshop connected to me outside work. If you let me stay with you, he'll have a reason to say you're biased, that the records you kept aren't objective, that you're complicit, and he'll use that reason to invalidate the books." Juno set her cup down more slowly than usual. "You're calculating." "I'm calculating. You just lost your job, lost your home, got reported to the association, and you're sitting in a coffee shop calculating." "I don't have many things to do besides calculate, Juno." Marin leaned forward, both elbows on the table, her 10 fingers woven together. She spoke more slowly, more clearly, the way someone did when she was arranging each piece in her mind and setting them on the table one by one. "I need you inside the workshop. I need you to keep going to work every day, keep recording every day, and give Aldrich no reason to suspect you. You're the only one with proof that the ingredients I used for the past 3 years didn't belong to the house. Those books are the only thing proving I didn't use a single gram of Sable's materials. If you leave now, if he knows you're on my side, he'll find a way to destroy the books or discredit them, and then I'll have nothing left." Juno looked at Marin for a long time. She didn't nod right away. She looked the way she looked at a ledger column before signing off on it, carefully, surely, without missing a single line. Then she nodded. "Once, I understand," Juno said. "I'll stay in the workshop. I'll keep the records. And when needed, I'll appear with every page. Thank you. I told you. Don't thank me. Keep thinking." Juno stood. She swung her bag over her shoulder and looked at Marin for another moment, not with worry, but with confirmation. Confirmation that the woman sitting in front of her was still the woman she knew, still capable of calculation, still capable of standing. Then she turned and walked out of the coffee shop. Not another word. Not a look back. Marin sat alone. The second coffee was still hot. She drank it slowly. Outside the window, Brooklyn at midday passed by without looking in. Cars moving, people walking, the city running in its ordinary way. Marin sat at the table in the farthest corner, the same place she had sat at 18 with $17 in her pocket. And she thought. She didn't think about what had been lost. She thought about what remained. The notebook in her right coat pocket, the sample bottle in her left coat pocket, Juno inside the workshop, and a man named Knox Gallagher, who had looked at her hands and seen what no one had bothered to see for 3 years. She didn't yet know what to do with that, but she knew it existed, and sometimes, knowing that something existed was enough to begin calculating the next move. Marin was still at the coffee shop at 11 o'clock at night. She hadn't planned to stay that late. It was just that she had opened the notebook to reread the notes on the cold enfleurage method, then started writing in the margins with a pencil, then realized she was calculating a variation of the formula she had never tried before. And when she looked up, the shop was empty except for the night shift server, wiping the counter, and the fluorescent light flickering in the corner of the ceiling where the bulb was about to burn out. She didn't hear the door open. She only realized someone was there because the air in the shop changed. Not cold, not wind, something harder to name. The feeling of someone stepping into a room and the room automatically rearranging itself around their presence, as if the space recognized that the most important person inside it had just changed. Marin looked up. Knox Gallagher stood in the doorway of the 24-hour coffee shop in Brooklyn at 11:15 at night. He wore a dark coat, with no one beside him, no car parked out front that she could see through the glass. And he walked in alone in a way Marin understood at once that this wasn't business. A man like Knox Gallagher didn't come to a cheap coffee shop in Brooklyn near midnight for business. Business sent someone else. Business took place in high-floor offices, through lawyers, through assistants, through all the layers of distance that men in his position built, so they never had to do anything with their own hands, unless they chose to. He had come here himself. What that meant, Marin didn't know yet, but she noted it. Knox pulled out the chair across from Marin and sat down. He didn't ask permission, but he didn't sit as though he owned the chair either. He sat as though he had decided he would sit there before he ever entered the shop, and that decision required no confirmation from anyone. He placed both hands on the table, palms down, fingers straight. Marin looked at his hands. Not rough hands, but not hands that had never done anything either. There were a few small marks along the knuckles, the kind time left behind without explaining. "The sample Sable sent me is completely wrong," Knox said. No greeting, no opening. The first thing he said to her in that Brooklyn coffee shop near midnight was a technical assessment, and Marin understood that this was how he respected her. He didn't check on her. He didn't offer pity. He spoke to her in the language of what she did best. "I know," Marin said. Terrence used the wrong heart note. Harsh in the middle, shallow in the base. He either used cashmere in the wrong ratio or used Mysore instead of cashmere, and he didn't cure it long enough. Knox tilted his head slightly. "Where did you smell it from?" "The hallway. I walked past the lab every morning for 3 days after I was locked out. The scent came through the gap under the door." He looked at her, not with an empty stare, but the way a man looked at an important document, studying every line, every word, weighing whether this document deserved a place on his desk. He tapped the tips of 2 index fingers lightly on the table, slow, even, as if counting a rhythm in his head. "You know Sable filed a complaint with the association?" he asked. "I know." "You know he's trying to bar you from practicing?" "I know." "And you're sitting in a Brooklyn coffee shop at midnight, making notes in a 100-year-old notebook." "I don't have another lab to sit in." Knox stopped tapping his fingers. He leaned back in the chair, set both hands on the armrests, and looked at Marin in a new way, no longer assessing, but closer to deciding, the look of a man who had finished reading the document and was signing his name. "I have a laboratory," he said. "Not in Manhattan, beneath where I live. The materials in it don't exist anywhere else in the world. Some are more than 100 years old. No one has touched them since the person who created them died." Marin didn't react right away. She sat still, the pencil still caught between 2 fingers, the notebook open in front of her, and she listened to every word Knox said with the same attention she gave each drop of essential oil when blending. Nothing missed. "No hurry. I don't give charity," Knox continued. "I don't rescue. I'm offering cooperation. You have something I need. The ability to read formulas no one has been able to read in more than 100 years. I have something you need. Materials and a place to work that Aldrich Sable can't touch." Marin closed the notebook. Slowly, set the pencil down beside the cold coffee. Then she looked directly at Knox, into his eyes, and she spoke in the same voice she had used when she first spoke to him in the 3rd-floor hallway. Flat, unafraid, unhesitating, the voice of someone who knew her worth and didn't discount it. "I need to know who you are before I step into your home." Knox didn't blink. He looked at her for 2 more seconds, and in those 2 seconds, Marin saw something very small move behind his eyes, not hesitation, closer to the calculation between a careful answer and a true one. Then he said, "Come see, then decide for yourself." He stood, placed a bill on the table beside Marin's coffee, enough to pay for both cups and the tip. Exact, no more, no less. Then he walked to the door. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for her to stand and follow. He stepped out into the Brooklyn night and let the coffee shop door close behind him, and Marin sat alone in the chair with the 100-year-old notebook closed and an unanswered offer lying on the table between 2 cold cups of coffee. She sat there for another 5 minutes. Then she stood, slipped the notebook into her coat pocket, and walked out the door. She arrived the following evening. Knox met her at the penthouse building's gate alone. No assistant, no staff, only him in the early Manhattan darkness and the November cold pressed close to the sidewalk. He said nothing as he led her into the private elevator, up to the 47th floor, through a living room Marin didn't look at, because she hadn't come here to see a penthouse. Then down a stone staircase at the back that she had to tilt her body to notice because it was hidden behind a door without a handle. The staircase descended. The air changed after the 5th step. Cooler. Still. Scented. Not the smell of a cellar. Not dampness or concrete or pipes. It was a scent Marin Cole couldn't find a name for. A scent that made both her hands begin to tremble when it reached her nose at the foot of the stairs, and Knox stood behind her, watching her shake without saying a word. She had already told that part. The part she hadn't told was what happened after the trembling stopped. Marin stepped into the cellar. Low ceiling, stone walls, a single lamp hanging in the far corner casting pale yellow light over 2 rows of wooden shelves running along the walls. She didn't look at the whole room. She looked at the shelf. She walked to the row on the left and stopped at the first jar. Brown glass, wax-sealed lid, and on the label was handwriting. She knew that handwriting. She had read it every night for 8 weeks. She had decoded every slanted stroke, every blurred letter, every water-damaged number on the yellowed pages of the brown-covered notebook with the red-stitched spine. The handwriting on the jar and the handwriting in the notebook were the same. Her throat tightened. She didn't turn to look at Knox. She stood in front of the shelf, the fingers of her left hand touching the edge of the jar's label lightly, and she felt the rough paper beneath her fingertip, old and thin and real. "Margot Delacroix," Knox said behind her. His voice echoed softly in the stone cellar, low and even, unhurried. "My family began sponsoring her in 1847. She was the finest perfumer of her time, perhaps the finest who ever lived." He paused. She didn't share her formulas with anyone, not even the people who paid her. She delivered only the finished product. The formulas she kept for herself, in her own notebook. Marin drew her hand back from the jar's label. She moved along the shelf slowly, reading each label with her eyes without touching. The handwriting was the same on every jar. The same hand. The same way of writing a capital M with a long curve at the base. The same way of writing numbers with a diagonal stroke through the 7. She reached the end of the shelf and stopped. The last jar was smaller than the others. Clear glass instead of brown. The wax seal had yellowed, and on the label, there was no name. Only a mark, a small drawing Marin didn't recognize. Not a letter, not a number, more like a symbol the writer had created for herself. "What is this?" she asked. "I don't know," Knox said. He stepped closer, standing beside Marin but not too close, keeping just enough distance so she wouldn't have to step back. "The family journals say Margot called it the final note, the thing she added last, before sealing the lid. She didn't name the ingredient. She didn't explain. And no one in my family ever opened the jar to check." Marin looked at the jar, looked at the symbol on the label. Then she turned to look at Knox for the first time since she had stepped down into the cellar. "How long have you kept all this?" "Since I was old enough to understand they had value," Knox said. "My father kept them before that. My grandfather before him." "Why?" Knox looked at the shelves. The yellow lamplight fell across his face. And in that light, for the first time, Marin saw something behind his calmness. Not weakness, not sadness, but the depth of someone who had kept something for so long, without knowing why that he had finally grown used to keeping it. "Because no one knew what to do with them," he said, "and no one had the heart to throw them away." The cellar was very quiet. No machines, no wind, no city noise. Only the scent from the jars sealed decades ago still drifting faintly through the wax lids, light and old and patient. Marin took the notebook from her coat pocket, opened it, set it beside the row of jars on the shelf. The handwriting in the notebook and the handwriting on the labels sat beside each other. The same hand, separated by more than 100 years. "This notebook," Marin said. "She wrote it." "Yes, and you were looking for it." "I was. For a very long time. But I was looking in the wrong places." He looked at the notebook on the shelf. "I looked in auction houses, in private collections, in museums. I didn't think of a Brooklyn thrift market." $12, Marin said. "I bought the whole box for the glass vials." Knox looked at her. Then something shifted on his face, very small, only at the corner of his eyes. Not a smile, but the place where a smile could have existed if he allowed it. $12, he repeated. Then he stepped back toward the stairs. "The cellar is yours tonight. The materials on the shelves. Use anything you need. If you need to ask about Margot's methods, the family journals are upstairs." He stopped on the first stair. "I'll be upstairs. Knock if you need anything." Then he went up. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone, then disappeared. Marin stood alone in the perfume cellar beneath the 47th floor of Manhattan, one hand holding the 100-year-old notebook, surrounded by jars of materials no one in the world still sold, and she began to work. Knox was still standing at the foot of the stairs when Marin opened the first jar. She knew he was there because she could feel it. That familiar awareness when a room held another person without needing to turn and check. She set the jar down on the blending table, an old wooden surface worn into faint circular patterns where someone had placed and turned bottles hundreds of times, and she spoke without turning around. "I don't work with someone watching. No explanation, no apology." She said it the way one stated a fact of physics, the way one said water boiled at 100 degrees or essential oil would evaporate if left uncapped. Knox didn't argue. He didn't ask why. Marin heard his steps on the stone staircase, even and light, rising one by one until they disappeared above. The door closed. The cellar belonged to her. She worked, opened each jar from left to right, lifting the wax seals carefully, tilting the glass to smell without letting too much air in. Most of the materials were still good, unbelievably good for their age. The wax seals and the steady temperature of the stone cellar had preserved them in a state close to their original form. She began with the top note. Iris. She opened the jar of iris extracted by cold enfleurage, inhaled, and nearly stopped breathing at the quality. This iris was nothing like anything she had ever worked with. It was deeper, rounder, the depth of a well, while everything she had bought on the market was only rainwater pooled on the surface. She worked slowly and precisely, her hands steady, her breath through her nose, her mind narrowing into a single point, focused on proportion and sequence. Around her was the silence of stone and time. Near midnight, she encountered a problem. The 7th jar on the shelf, cashmere sandalwood. When she broke the wax seal and tilted the bottle, the scent that rose wasn't right. Not completely spoiled, but altered. The top layer of oil had oxidized, creating a faint sour note that any trained nose would detect. She couldn't use it directly. If she did, that sourness would seep into the heart and ruin the entire structure. The same mistake Terrence had made at Sable. But here it would be subtler and far more difficult to correct. She needed to know how Margot had preserved this jar. If she understood the original method, she could separate the oxidized layer without damaging the oil beneath. That information wasn't in the formula notebook. The notebook recorded ratios and sequence, not preservation. But Knox had said the family journals were upstairs. She wiped her hands with a cloth, set the cashmere jar back on the table, sealed it loosely, and went up the stairs. Knox's study was at the end of the hallway, on the 47th floor. The door was open. The desk lamp was on. He was awake. He sat at his desk, back straight, both hands resting on the surface, and in front of him was an open file. Marin stopped at the doorway. She hadn't meant to look, but she looked. The file on Knox's desk wasn't a real estate contract, not a financial report from Gallagher Holdings. She couldn't read the contents from where she stood, but she saw how the pages were arranged, saw handwritten notes in the margins, saw numbers without clear currency units, saw names of people and places abbreviated in a way meant for no one else to understand. She didn't need the details to know she was looking at the part of Knox Gallagher's life that he didn't display in any property tour. Knox looked up. He saw her at the door. He saw where her gaze had fallen. He didn't startle. He didn't cover the file. He simply closed it, slowly, calmly, like closing a book he had finished reading, and set it aside. No explanation, no denial, no attempt to correct what she might think. "I need the family journal," Marin said. "The part about Margot's preservation methods. The cashmere jar has oxidized at the top." Knox opened a drawer, took out a thick, black, leather-bound notebook, the corners worn. He handed it to her. Marin took it. They looked at each other across the desk, between the light of the lamp, between a file that had been closed and a journal just opened, and neither of them spoke about what she had seen. She turned and went back down to the cellar. She found the preservation method on page 43 of the journal, written in black ink, capital letters from a man 3 generations earlier, stating that Margot used a thin layer of jojoba oil over the surface of the essential oil before sealing it with wax to prevent oxidation. Marin separated the oxidized layer by decanting, kept the clean oil beneath, and continued. Near 4 in the morning, she paused at the base note, "Cashmere or Mysore?" Margot's notebook said cashmere, but Marin needed to be sure the man she was working with could tell the difference. She sent Knox a message. Base note. "Margot used cashmere, not Mysore. Can you tell them apart?" 3 minutes later, footsteps on the stairs. Knox came down. He walked to the blending table, where Marin had prepared 2 mouillette strips, each dipped in a sample, placed apart on the surface. He picked up the left strip, smelled, set it down, picked up the right, smelled, set it down. "The left is Mysore," he said. "The base is shallower, slightly sweet, fades quickly. The right is cashmere, deeper. There's a raw wood note at the end." "Correct. Both points." Marin looked at him, and she understood that Knox Gallagher wasn't just a collector of old perfume. He had a nose, a real one, the kind the industry called a gift and Marin called useful. From that moment, he stayed in the cellar. Not because she asked him to, but because he had proven his presence wasn't for watching. It was to contribute. They worked through the rest of the night, Marin blending, Knox reading the family journal and answering when she asked. Near 5 in the morning, as Marin finished the third note, Knox spoke, his eyes still on the open journal. "There's something you should know about me before morning." Marin paused. The dropper held in the air, a single drop of oil suspended at the tip, not yet fallen. "But not now," he said, still not looking up. "Right now, you need to focus." The drop fell into the bottle. Marin continued working, but the sentence remained in the cellar like a scent left on skin, not fading, not dispersing, only waiting. The next morning, after Marin had left the penthouse with Margot's notebook in her coat pocket and the scent of 100-year-old essential oils still clinging to her wrist, Reed arrived. Knox's right hand, the man who managed everything Gallagher Holdings didn't record in its public books. Reed didn't call ahead. He didn't need to call ahead. He had keys to every door Knox owned, including the doors that didn't exist on paper, and he used that privilege very rarely, only when he judged that something needed to be said that no one else would say. Today was one of those times. Knox was sitting at his desk. The file from the night before had been put away. Only the family journal and a cup of coffee remained on the desk. Reed stood across from him. He didn't sit. He never sat when speaking to Knox about matters he considered serious, because sitting meant equality, and Reed didn't want equality in these conversations. He wanted it clear that he was reporting, warning, fulfilling the role that 30 years inside the Gallagher family had given him. "You're letting an outsider step into the most private part of your life," Reed said. No opening, no easing into it. The first sentence was the most important one, and Reed didn't waste time on unimportant sentences. In this world, that's a vulnerability. Knox didn't react. He took a sip of coffee, set the cup down. The cup touched the desk very lightly. He looked at Reed with a gaze Reed had learned to read over 15 years of working with Knox. A gaze that said, "I'm listening. Continue," but also said, "I thought about this before you ever came here." "She knows the cellar exists," Reed continued. "She knows the collection. She knows the materials. She knows you keep the family journals in your desk drawer. She spent the night in this penthouse." He stopped, not for drama, but to choose his words. Because Reed was a man who chose words very carefully. If she tells the wrong person, you don't lose a collection. You lose position. Knox placed both hands on the desk, palms down, fingers straight, a posture Reed had seen thousands of times. The posture Knox used when he was deciding whether to say more than one sentence. Then Knox spoke. "She kept the formula notebook for 3 years. Reed blinked. He didn't understand immediately. 3 years, Knox repeated. "She worked for Aldrich Sable for 3 years. Every day, she went into that lab, blended from formulas taken from that notebook, delivered finished products to Sable, and not once did she tell him the notebook existed. Sable thought the formulas came from her skill. He didn't know there was a notebook. He didn't know the original formulas were Margot's. He knew nothing beyond the finished work she placed on his table every week." Knox stopped, looked straight at Reed. She kept that secret for 3 years from the man who paid her every month, the man she depended on completely for money, the man she saw every day. Not once did she slip. Not once did she expose it. Not because anyone told her to keep it. Because she decided for herself that it was hers, and no one else needed to know. Knox took another sip of coffee. "She knows how to keep secrets better than most people in this organization, Reed. And she did it without anyone paying her $1 extra. The study was very quiet. Morning light came through the glass on the 47th floor, casting a long streak across the wooden floor between the two men. Reed looked at Knox. He looked for a long time. The way he looked when he was assessing not the information but the person giving it, weighing whether Knox was saying this from reason or from something else Reed had never seen in his employer in 15 years. Then Reed nodded. Once, not full agreement. Acceptance. A way of saying, "I hear your argument. I'm not fully at ease, but I trust your decision enough not to challenge it further." He turned and walked to the door, stopped at the threshold, didn't turn back. "If I'm wrong about her," Reed said, "then it's fine. But if you're wrong about her, I won't be the one who pays the price." Then he left. Knox sat alone. He looked at the family journal on the desk. The black leather-bound notebook he had handed to Marin Cole the night before without hesitation. And he thought about what Reed hadn't said, but they both understood. That this was the first time in 15 years Knox had allowed someone outside the organization to touch the part of himself he kept private. And that Knox hadn't done it because of the notebook, or the formula, or the scent. He had done it because when Maren Cole stood in the doorway of his study last night and saw the file on his desk, she didn't ask. She didn't show fear. She took the journal, turned away, and went back down to the cellar to work. And that was the thing Knox Gallagher, a man used to everyone either fearing him or wanting something from him, didn't know what to do with. 3 days after the night in the cellar, Maren returned to her old apartment to collect her things. She had 30 days from the landlord's call, and she had already used 5 of them, leaving 25 days to clear out an apartment where she had lived for 2 years, but had never truly made into a home. She didn't own much. A few sets of clothes, a few technical books, the personal blending kit she had bought with her own money. She opened the door with her key. The lock opened normally. The door opened normally. But something wasn't normal. She stood at the threshold and looked. Not at the apartment. At the door. The top hinge had a small scratch she had never seen before. Shallow, fresh. Exactly where metal would scrape if someone had removed the hinge and put it back. And at the lower edge of the door frame, near the floor, there was a thin black thread she knew for certain wasn't hers, because she owned no black clothing made of that fabric. She didn't panic. She noted it. She gathered her things, placed them into 2 bags, locked the door, and left. On the way back to her temporary shelter, the 24-hour coffee shop where she had paid to sit through the night for 3 straight nights, she began to notice other things. Not all at once. Gradually, the way scent reveals itself, one layer arriving after another. A car parked on the corner near the coffee shop that she had seen all 3 days. Same spot, same direction. And she wasn't someone who noticed cars, but she was someone who noticed repetition, because 3 years of checking blending ratios had taught her that when something appeared in the same place too many times, it wasn't random. A man sitting in the coffee shop whom she had never seen before, seated at the table near the window, ordering coffee but not drinking it. And she recognized him not because of his face but because of the way he sat, the discomfort of someone there for work, not for coffee. And then, on the second day after she noticed those things, she noticed another layer. Someone was watching the people watching her. She knew because the car on the corner disappeared on the 4th day, suddenly, cleanly, as if it had never been parked there. The man in the coffee shop didn't come back, and in their place, in other positions, farther away, better hidden, there were new presences she could only feel at the edge of her vision, not close enough to confirm, but steady enough for her to know that someone had cleared away the first layer of surveillance and replaced it with a second layer of protection. Knox's people. It didn't take her long to reach that conclusion. No one else in Maren Cole's life had the ability to operate something on that scale without leaving obvious traces, and no one else had a reason. She went to the penthouse that afternoon. No call ahead. She rang the bell. The person who opened the door wasn't Knox. It was Reed. He stood in the doorway, looked at her for 2 seconds, then stepped aside to let her in. Said nothing. Didn't need to. His presence at the penthouse door at this moment said enough. Said he knew she would come, knew why she had come, and had been waiting here not to stop her, but to observe her. Knox was in the study. He looked up when Maren walked in. Maren didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the room, her bag still on her shoulder, her coat still on, and she spoke. Someone went into my old apartment. The door hinge was removed and put back. A car followed me for 3 days in Brooklyn, and your people handled it without telling me. Knox set his pen down. I don't need to be protected without knowing what I'm being protected from, Maren said. Her voice didn't rise. There was no anger. There was clarity. The kind of clarity that belonged to someone who had lived long enough with no one standing behind her, to know that when someone began standing behind her without being asked, she needed to know why. Knox looked at her. Then he looked toward the door, where Reed still stood, leaning against the frame, arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable, in the position of a man who had heard everything and was waiting to see how Knox would answer. Knox looked back at Maren. Sit down, he said. I'll answer. Everything. Maren looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down. Knox didn't begin at the beginning. He began in the middle, because men like Knox Gallagher didn't tell stories in chronological order. They told them in the order of importance. Gallagher Holdings is the front, he said. His voice was low, even, neither rising nor falling. The voice Marin had heard enough times to know this was the voice he used when every word had been weighed before it was spoken. Real estate, luxury brands, legal investments, all of it is real. All of it makes money, and all of it serves one purpose, which is moving cash flow from operations that don't appear on any tax report into clean numbers in bank records. Marin sat still, both hands on her lap, back straight, eyes fixed on Knox. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't react. She listened. The Gallagher family has operated outside the law for 3 generations, Knox continued. My grandfather started at the New York docks, controlling goods moving in and out. My father expanded into rare materials, things the legitimate market couldn't supply enough of, or couldn't supply at all. I took over and built Gallagher Holdings into the legal front, but behind it is still the same system. I control most of the underground commerce along the East Coast. Rare materials, goods that don't pass through customs, and agreements no one takes to court. He stopped, not for drama, to give Marin time to process. The perfume collection is my most private secret, he said, and his voice changed on that sentence, half a shade softer, the kind of softness Marin might almost have missed if she weren't someone who had spent 3 years telling apart 2 samples of essential oil, separated by 1/10 of a gram. No one in this world knows, no partners, no rivals, no one in the organization, except Reed. That cellar, those jars of materials, those family journals, all of it exists in the part of my life I don't allow anyone to touch. He looked at Marin. Until last week. The study was very quiet. Afternoon light slanted through the glass and crossed the wooden floor, dividing the room into 2 halves, one bright, one dark, and Knox sat on the line between them, and Marin thought that was probably the most accurate position for describing this man. I'm not saying this so you'll sympathize, Knox said. I don't need you to understand my reasons. I don't need you to accept them. I'm saying it so you have enough information to decide. If you want to stay, you stay. If you want to go, you go. Both choices are open. Then he stopped, and he waited. He waited in a way Marin had never seen anyone wait. Not waiting for an answer, waiting for judgment. The kind of waiting that belonged to a man who had placed everything on the table and knew that what came next might be refusal. And he was used to every kind of refusal in the world except this one. Refusal from someone he couldn't buy, couldn't command, couldn't control with any tool 3 generations of his family had given him. Marin was silent for a long time. She looked at Knox, looked at his hands resting on the desk, looked at the family journal beside the coffee cup, looked toward the office door, where Reed had still been standing when she entered but had now gone. Silently, no one knowing when, leaving behind an empty space in the frame that Marin noticed, because she was used to noticing absence. Then she spoke. Slowly, clearly. Each word set down like drops of essential oil into a bottle. Exact, no excess, nothing missing. I don't judge you by what you are. I judge you by how you treat me. Knox didn't move. You gave me the cellar. You gave me the materials. You handed me the journal when I needed it without asking why. You sat in the cellar all night and answered my questions about cashmere sandalwood without once demanding anything in return. She stopped. One beat. A beat the whole room held. I'm here for the work. Not for patronage. Not for protection. That boundary doesn't change. If there's ever a moment when that boundary is erased, I'll leave, and you won't stop me. Knox looked at her. He didn't nod. Didn't say he understood. Didn't confirm it with any words at all. He only looked, and on his face was an expression Marin didn't have the exact word for. The closest she could describe it was the expression of a man used to being refused everything except power. And for the first time in his life, meeting someone who looked straight at that power and said, "It isn't your power I need. It's the blending table and the materials. Keep the rest for yourself." Then Knox spoke, his voice lighter than any time before, so quiet Marin had to listen to hear it. "The people near the coffee shop won't come back. You don't need to know more." Marin looked at him. She understood what that sentence meant. She understood that you don't need to know more wasn't because Knox looked down on her, but because there were parts of his life where knowing about them was a burden, and he was choosing not to place that burden on her. She didn't ask further. "I'll go down to the cellar," she said. "There's a batch that needs finishing." She stood, pushed the chair back in, walked to the door, stopped in the frame, exactly where Reed had stood earlier. "Knox." He looked up. It was the first time she had called him by his name. Thank you for telling me the truth." Then she went down to the cellar, and Knox Gallagher sat alone in the study on the 47th floor, looking at the chair Marin had just occupied, and realized that for the first time in many years, someone had thanked him not for the power he offered, but for the truth he hadn't hidden. On the final night in the cellar, Marin began working at 9 o'clock in the evening. She didn't turn on the main light. She used only the hanging lamp in the corner of the shelf, its pale yellow glow just enough to read the labels and see the color of the oil in the dropper. She didn't need more than that. Most of her work relied on her nose, not her eyes. She started again from the beginning. The top note. Iris. She had blended this part twice in the previous nights, but tonight she did it again, because she wanted the entire bottle to be created in a single flow, from the first drop to the last, unbroken, undivided, the way Margot had done it, according to the notebook. One breath, one night, one hand, from start to finish. The heart note. Cashmere sandalwood, the oxidized layer already removed, labdanum resin in a 3-to-1 ratio, briefly cured in ethanol, then transferred into jojoba oil, using the method she had found in the family journal. Her hands were steady, her breathing slow. The cellar was so quiet she could hear the oil touching the inside of the glass, a sound as small as rain falling onto still water. Then, the base. She paused at the last jar on the shelf. Small, clear glass, yellowed wax seal, a nameless mark. Margot's final note. The thing Knox said he didn't know, but Marin knew. She had known since the second night in the cellar, when she opened the jar and smelled it, and the scent reached her with the precision of a memory she didn't own but recognized. Ambergris. She knew the scent of ambergris. She knew it because she had read about it in Margot's notebook, not by name, but by description. A slanted line written on the last page, half blurred by water, the thing the sea returns after 100 years. Margot hadn't written the name because in her time, everyone knew what ambergris was. Everyone knew its scent, its place in a formula, the way it anchored the entire structure and held the base against the skin for hours instead of letting it vanish in the first minutes. It had been common enough not to need naming, like water in a recipe. But 100 years later, when natural ambergris had almost disappeared from the market and only synthetic versions remained, easily distinguished by any trained nose, the small unlabeled jar in Knox Gallagher's cellar had become the rarest thing on the shelf. She opened it, tilted it, drew exactly the amount she needed with the dropper, precise to the last drop. Let it fall into the bottle. Sealed it. Finished. She set the bottle on the table, set the dropper down, wiped her hands with a cloth. Then she stood in front of the blending table, looking at the finished perfume resting on the worn wood beneath the yellow light, and she did nothing. She just stood there. Somewhere above, there were quiet footsteps on the stone stairs. Knox came down. He stopped at the last step. He didn't look at the bottle first. He smelled. Marin saw the slight movement of his nose, the way he inhaled slowly and deeply, the way he stood still on the step without moving closer, because he was letting the scent come to him instead of going to it. Then he opened his eyes. "The final note," he said. "You figured out what it is." "Ambergris," Marin said. "The unlabeled jar." Margot didn't write the name because in her time, everyone knew. It didn't need to be written. Knox stepped to the table, looked at the bottle, looked at Marin's hands, clean but still carrying the scent, always carrying it. The scent of century-old materials absorbed into the lines of her skin where no solvent could remove it. Marin placed a drop from the bottle onto her wrist. Slow, precise, brought her wrist to her nose. Inhaled. The top, the heart, the base, the final note. Everything was there. Everything correct. Everything fitting together like pieces of something taken apart more than 100 years ago, and now reassembled by the hands of a 27-year-old woman standing in a stone cellar beneath Manhattan. Her hands didn't tremble. She noticed it without emotion. The first time she had held a dropper in this cellar, her hands had shaken. Now they didn't. Not because she was no longer afraid, because she was finished. "This is the first time in my life I've completed something no one can take away," she said. She wasn't speaking to Knox. She was speaking to the cellar, to the shelves of materials, to Margot's handwriting on the labels, to the brown notebook in her coat pocket, to the nameless woman who had written those lines more than 100 years ago, without knowing that one day a girl who grew up on her own in Brooklyn would buy her notebook for $12 and finish what she had begun. Knox turned his face away, only for a second, then back again. Marin noticed. She said nothing. There were things that, once spoken, became smaller, and she left it where it belonged. Between them, in a cellar that carried the scent of a century long gone, and a bottle of perfume that had just come back to life. The Fragrance Association's meeting room was on the 6th floor of an old building on Murray Hill. Dark wood walls, a long rectangular table, 7 leather chairs for the council and 4 plain chairs for the involved parties. Neutral ground. Not Aldrich's workshop. Not Knox's penthouse. Just a room with a long table and the truth about to be said upon it. Aldrich Sable arrived 15 minutes early. He sat on the left side of the table, back straight, cuffs adjusted, the expression of a man confident in the system, because he had spent 20 years understanding how it worked, and another 2 weeks securing the support of a few council members. He brought a case file, copies of the confidentiality agreement Marin had signed 3 years earlier, and Terence Holt sat beside him as a technical witness. Marin arrived on time. She wore the coat she wore every day, the inner left pocket still slightly heavy with the sample bottle, the right pocket still weighted by the brown notebook. She sat across from Aldrich. She looked at him and he looked at her, and between them was the long wooden table and 3 years. Knox sat at the end of the room, a chair against the wall, away from the table. He didn't sit with the involved parties. He sat as an observer, back against the chair, hands resting on the armrests, and he said nothing as everyone took their places. Reed stood near the door, leaning against the wall, arms at his sides, expression unreadable. The association representative sat at the head of the table, opened the file, skimmed the complaint, and said, "Mr. Sable has filed a complaint accusing Miss Cole of violating a confidentiality agreement by disclosing production processes to a third party. Miss Cole, do you have a response?" Marin didn't answer with words. She opened her coat, took out the sample bottle she had kept from the day she was locked out of the lab, the one she had wrapped in cloth and placed in her pocket before anything else, the one she had carried across the Brooklyn Bridge, through the 24-hour coffee shop, through the cellar beneath the 47th floor penthouse. And now she set it on the wooden table. Then she took a second bottle from her bag, the one she had created in Knox's cellar, the complete one, the one with ambergris. She set it beside the first, 2 bottles on the table, side by side. "The bottle on the left is the sample I created at Sable 8 weeks ago," Marin said, her voice even, clear, the voice of someone who didn't need to persuade, only to present truth and let it speak. "The bottle on the right is the sample I created last week, using materials not belonging to Sable, in a laboratory not belonging to Sable." She looked around the table, looked at the council, looked at Aldrich. "And this is the bottle Mr. Sable introduced at the launch in Tribeca, under the name of Mr. Terence Holt." She placed the third bottle on the table, the one Juno had brought her that morning, taken from the launch, the same sample the reviewer had smelled and described as slightly harsh in the heart and lacking depth in the base. "Please smell," Marin said. The council complied. One by one, each person, 3 bottles, in order. No one spoke during the process, but Marin watched their faces and she saw the moment when their noses reached Terence's bottle and their brows tightened, just slightly, enough for anyone in the field to recognize. And she saw the moment when they smelled her bottles, both of them, and their brows relaxed, and one of them closed his eyes for a second, the kind of second a person only allows when a scent lands exactly where it should. No explanation needed. The nose didn't lie. Terence's sample lacked. It lacked in the heart, lacked in the base, lacked everywhere a century-old formula demanded precision to the last drop. Marin's samples were complete, alive, carrying a depth no one in that room had encountered in any commercial product for 20 years. Juno stepped forward. She placed the ingredient ledger on the table beside the 3 bottles. 3 years. Every page, every line, every gram. Miss Cole's materials were purchased separately, recorded separately, stored separately. Juno said, her voice dry and exact like the numbers in her ledger. Not a single gram came from Sable's inventory. Every transaction has a receipt. Every receipt has a date. 3 years. Not a single missing line. Aldrich opened his mouth. "The council should consider that Miss Cole worked under my authority, using my facilities, during hours I paid for, and any product." Knox stood. From the back of the room, without haste, he walked to the table and placed a file down. The receipt for the notebook from the Brooklyn Antique Market, dated, itemized, a certification report confirming the paper and ink dated to the mid-19th century, and a chain of ownership, documentation Knox himself had prepared, proving the notebook had never been property of Sable Fragrances, had never been inside the Sable workshop before Marin brought it there, and had belonged to her before she signed any contract with Aldrich. Knox said nothing. He set the file down, returned to his seat at the back. Saturday. The room fell silent. The association representative read the file, read the ledger, looked at the 3 bottles, read further, then closed the file. "The complaint is dismissed," he said. "There is no basis for the allegation of confidentiality breach. The formula notebook is not property of the workshop. The materials were purchased independently with personal funds. Miss Cole's professional standing is unaffected." Aldrich looked at the bottles on the table. 3 of them. 2 by Marin, 1 by Terence carrying his name. He didn't need to smell to know the difference. He had known before he entered the room. He had simply wagered that the system would protect him regardless of what the scent revealed. He was wrong. Aldrich stood, said nothing, didn't look at Marin, didn't look at Knox. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs one last time, and walked out of the room. His steps were even, his back straight, his rhythm unchanged. The rhythm of a man who had lost but refused to let his body show it. The door closed behind him. Reed remained by the doorway, watching Aldrich pass without moving, then looked into the room, looked at Knox, looked at Marin, and gave a slight nod before turning away. Marin remained seated at the table, the 3 bottles in front of her, Juno's ledger still open, Knox's documentation still on the table, and she sat there, both hands resting on the wooden surface, and she didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't celebrate. She simply breathed, even, slow, through her nose, and she could smell her own perfume in the air of the meeting room, the scent she had created, the scent no one could take from her anymore. Outside the meeting room, the 6th-floor hallway was quiet. Marin stood by the window at the end of the hall, looking down at Murray Hill Street without truly seeing anything. Juno stood beside her, bag over her shoulder, ready to leave, but not yet leaving. "The reviewer posted a comparison of the 2 samples this morning," Juno said. "Sable lost 3 distribution contracts before 10 o'clock. Marin didn't react. She knew Juno wasn't saying it to celebrate. Juno said it because it was data, and Juno delivered data cleanly, precisely, without emotion attached, leaving the recipient to decide what to do with it. Juno looked at Marin, longer than usual, longer than Juno normally looked at anyone, because Juno wasn't someone who looked for long. She looked quickly, understood quickly, and moved on to the next thing. But today she looked for a long time. "For 3 years, Juno said. I told you your nose was the rarest thing in this industry." She paused. The corner of her mouth lifted, very slightly, exactly 0.5 millimeter, the most Marin had ever seen Juno Park smile. "Glad someone with a 100-year-old perfume seller finally agrees with me." Marin laughed. A short, unexpected, uncontrolled laugh, the kind that escaped when the body had been holding tension for too many days, and suddenly found a crack through which to release it. Not loud, not long, just 1 beat, then gone, leaving warmth in her chest. Juno nodded once, then she turned and walked down the hallway, without looking back, without waving, without another word, exactly like her. Juno Park arrived when needed, and left when done, and she never turned departures into ceremonies because she knew she would return when returning was necessary, and Marin knew that too, so neither of them needed to say goodbye. Marin stood alone in the hallway. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She took it out. A message from a number she hadn't saved, but she knew who had sent it, because Juno had mentioned this woman's name the day before. An investor in the industry. A woman who ran an investment fund for independent fragrance brands. Someone who had read the comparison review of the 2 samples and wanted to meet Marin. The message was brief. An offer to fund her own workshop in Brooklyn, fully equipped, creative rights entirely belonging to Marin, her name on every product. Marin read the message twice, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. She had a choice. For the first time in 3 years, she had a real choice. Not a choice between bad and worse, but between good and good in a different way. She could open her own workshop. Her name on the door, her name on the bottle, her name on everything she created. No Aldrich Sable, no one else, only Marin Cole. She went to Knox's penthouse that afternoon. Knox opened the door. She entered, took the black leather-bound family journal from her bag, and placed it on the table. "I'm returning this." Knox picked up the journal and set it on the bookshelf beside his desk, next to the other notebooks. Marin Guest also held the history of the Gallagher family, 3 generations, 100 years, arranged neatly on a wooden shelf on the 47th floor of Manhattan. Marin didn't sit. She walked to the cellar door, the handleless door behind the living room, and stood there, looking down the stone stairs, into the darkness she had entered a few nights before, where her hands had trembled and then stopped trembling, where she had completed the best thing she had ever made. "An investor offered to help me open my own workshop in Brooklyn," she said. She spoke without turning around, spoke down the stairs, into the darkness, into the cellar. Knox stood by the desk behind her. He didn't come closer, didn't change his posture. "That's a good choice," he said. His voice was even, not holding, not persuading. Nothing in his voice suggested he wanted her to choose differently. He said that's a good choice in the voice he used for stating facts. And Marin understood that he meant it, that if she walked out this door today and never returned, he would let her go, and he would close the cellar door and continue keeping those 100-year-old jars alone, as he had before she appeared. Silence. The room held its silence. The stone stairs held theirs. Manhattan 47 floors below held its silence too. Then Marin said, still looking down the stairs, "The cashmere sandalwood you keep in the cellar. How much is left?" Behind her, Knox stood still. "Enough for roughly 20 years, he said. "If used sparingly. I'll need access." She turned back, looked at Knox. "Not every day. But when I need something no one in the world still sells." She didn't say "I'm staying." She didn't say "I choose you." She said "I need materials." And that was the most honest answer Marin Cole could give, because she hadn't come here for Knox Gallagher. She had come here for cashmere sandalwood and ambergris, an iris extracted through cold enfleurage, and a row of shelves holding what no one in the world still produced. She would open her own workshop in Brooklyn, her name on the door, her name on the bottle, and when she needed materials the world no longer had, she would go down into the cellar beneath the 47th floor of Manhattan and take them from the shelves marked in Margot Delacroix's handwriting. Not dependence, not ownership, not purchase, cooperation. Knox looked at her. Then he stepped toward the desk, and Marin heard the drawer open. Knox opened the drawer of his desk, the right drawer, the second one from the top. He took out a key, small, brass, old but not rusted, the kind of key that belonged to someone who carefully preserved whatever it opened. He placed the key on the desk, between them. He didn't hand it directly to her, didn't push it toward Marin. He only set it down, exactly halfway between his hand and hers, and left it there. Marin looked at the key. It lay on the wooden surface, between the family journal and the cold cup of coffee, small and heavier than it appeared, the kind of heavy that opened more than a door. She looked at Knox. He stood still on the other side of the desk, both hands at his sides, no gesture, no urging, no explanation. He had placed the key on the desk, and his part was done. The rest belonged to her. Marin picked up the key, lifted it between 2 fingers, thumb and index finger, felt its weight in her palm for exactly 1 second, then slipped it into her coat pocket, the left pocket, the same pocket where she had kept the sample bottle for the past 2 weeks. "I'll need more natural light in the east corner of the cellar," she said. "Whenever you need it," Knox said. Marin gave a slight nod. She walked toward the study door, 3 steps, then stopped. She didn't turn all the way around, only tilted her head to one side, just enough for her voice to travel directly to where Knox stood. "Margot's notebook. I want to keep the original. Not borrow it. Keep it." Knox stood still. For a moment. Not hesitation. The amount of time a person needed to look at something he had kept for a very long time and decide that it belonged to someone else, and take one final breath before letting go. "It was always yours," he said. 4 words. And Marin understood that he wasn't only talking about the notebook. Or perhaps he was talking about the notebook, but also about something larger than the notebook. Something they both knew and neither of them named because naming it would change it. And both of them wanted it to remain where it was, between the jars of 100-year-old oils and the slanted handwriting on the labels and the scent of a century that had already passed. Marin nodded once. She put on her coat, checked the left pocket, the key resting beside the sample bottle, checked the right pocket, the brown-covered notebook with the red stitched spine resting in its place. the same place it had occupied since the day she bought it at a Brooklyn antique market for $12. Then she stepped outside. Manhattan morning was cold. Wind from the Hudson River swept through the street, gray and sharp. The kind of November cold she knew well, because she had lived through enough winters in this city to understand that cold didn't kill anyone, it only reminded people they were still alive. The scent of cashmere sandalwood still lingered on her sleeve. Light, warm, the kind of scent that clung to fabric and stayed longer than people expected. Longer than even the one who made it. Longer than 100 years. She walked toward the subway, toward Brooklyn, toward the workshop she would open herself, where her name would be on the door, her name would be on the bottle, her name would be on everything she created from now until the day she could no longer create. Behind her, on the 47th floor of Manhattan, Knox Gallagher sat at his desk. The right drawer was still open. The place where the key had rested was now empty. On the desk, beside the business files, beside the family journal, was a blueprint. A natural lighting system for the east corner of the cellar. 2 small windows, UV-filtered glass to protect the materials, steel frames, installation in 3 days. He had ordered that blueprint 4 days earlier. Before Marin asked, before she knew she would ask, he had known. Because he had watched her work in the cellar under yellow light and seen her tilt bottles toward the light to check the color of the oil, and he had understood that a person who worked with eyes and nose would need real light to see truthfully, and he had ordered the blueprint because it was the only thing he could give that she would accept. Not money, not power, not protection. Light. Light for the east corner of the cellar, where Marin Cole would stand and blend and create things this world had forgotten, and remember them back into being. The room was very quiet, only the sound of Knox lifting his pen and beginning to write on the blueprint. Notes for the construction team, installation date, frame dimensions, type of glass. The sound of pen against paper was very small in the room on the 47th floor of Manhattan. And that was the final sound before this story ended. If this story touched your heart, please like it so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to know that talent doesn't need permission to shine. And subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment so we can hear the feelings from deep within your heart. We treasure every one of your shares. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.